He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
These boys were out on an adventure and they came across this body and they alerted the police, and when the authorities came, they saw that she was dressed in her maid's outfit and a coat.
In 1928, Bay of Plenty woman Elsie Walker disappeared from Papamoa. Days later, her body turned up in Auckland. I'm Jesse Mulligan, and you're listening to Crimes NZ, a podcast where we hear from people closest to some of New Zealand's most notorious crimes. In this episode, crime author Scott Bainbridge tells Charlotte Ryan about one of the oldest cold cases in Aotearoa.
I grew up in the 1970s, and that was the era of the motorised offender. And Mona Blades and the crew murders, that they were the ultimate mysterious unsolved murders. But for a generation before that, for many years, it was the mysterious deaths about Elsie Walker. So Elsie was a 17-year-old girl who lived on the East Cape, in a little remote hamlet called Rokokori, which is just up the coast from Tikaha. And her older sister had the benefit, like a lot of children in that era, that the older children had the benefit of a secondary education, and her older sister spent some time in Auckland and regaled tales of Elsie, of Auckland, to Elsie. And she, all she wanted to do was to go to Auckland to become a dressmaker, but her father forbade it because she wasn't really that great academically. But she rebelled, but a sort of like a concession was reached, and Elsie was able to go to Papamoa, where her father's sister had married into an affluent farming family. And she was to work as a housemaid for her relatives, for her cousins. But when she actually got there, she found that she was treated like nothing more than a slave. She never had her own bedroom. She lived in an annex off the main bedroom of her aunt and uncle. And she was treated like a slave by her relatives, including her 5 male cousins.
And what era are we talking? It's like the early 20s, isn't it?
Yeah, we're talking about the mid to late 1920s, where it was, girls back then didn't really, go into any profession other than, work in a factory or work as a housemaid, and that was a lot of girls from that era. That's what they did until they found husbands.
Yeah. So she moved from Gisborne, or the East Cape, to Papamoa. She was a housemaid. Did they still treat her with respect?
No, and I had access to the police files, which is some of the biggest files I've ever seen in my life, because they're contained in 12 boxes, and it's massive. And so I went through all of the papers, and certainly a lot of the witness statements, including the family themselves, say that they mistreated Elsie. She was allowed to eat with them, but then her daily task was to look after the 3-year-old, and then her auntie, who was Constance Bailey, who was a sort of loved her place in high society, so she basically had to follow her auntie around from morning tea to morning tea and just sit there in the corner. So she if she had hope for some sort of lease of freedom, she was sadly mistaken.
Oh, that's really sad. So then, tell me what happened after that, because she disappeared really randomly, didn't she?
Yeah, well, a few unusual things happened in the days before she disappeared, and that she was acting a little bit oddly. She had hit her head on a window while she was cleaning the window and had to sit down. And her aunt claimed later that after that she would just sort of daze into space. But on the night she disappeared, there was nothing unusual. The family were hosting a relative, a young woman of Elsie's age, who had come down from Auckland and regaled sort of stories about seeing Charles Kinsett Smith, land his plane, and Elsie had to do the washing up, and she was a little bit, I guess, perhaps embarrassed or jealous even, and she certainly seemed to be acting a little bit oddly. And that night, she was last seen putting the scraps of rubbish outside, and one of her older cousins was coming home from a dance, and he noticed the family vehicle wasn't in its garage, placed in its garage, and so he didn't really think too much of it until the next morning when they woke up and found that Elsie had disappeared as well as the car. It was regarded, quite oddly because, Elsie couldn't drive. There was no, apart from her behaviour, her odd behaviour, it was thought that maybe she, got a little bit of, felt a little bit jealous and then stole the family car and driven to Auckland. And sure enough, the vehicle was found the next day in Panmure, and then a day later, her body was found in bush under, in bush near Mount Wellington. Now, back then in 1928, Panmure and Mount Wellington were very, very much rural areas. They're not built up, wasn't built up. So, the vehicle was found, the tyre had been changed. And Elsie certainly, really odd. And
who found her body? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it was just two boys who were out. The area where her body was found was great. It was great big fields and bush, and so these boys were out on an adventure and they came across this body, and they alerted the police. And when the authorities came, they saw that she was dressed in her maid's outfit, in a coat, and which was odd for that time because anybody that wanted to go out of the family home, whatever class you're in or whatever city you lived in, you would always dress up in your Sunday best. So it was regarded that this was quite unusual for this housemaid to be still found in her housemaid's outfit. But there was no outward signs of violent death. There was like a 10-cent size bruise to her forehead. That was the only sign of any injury. So, they took the body back, and they initially thought that maybe she had hit her head or maybe she had ingested some sort of poison, and certainly that was the view for a wee while. But just the whole manner of her disappearance was just out of character, because she couldn't drive. So she would have taken the car, if that theory holds.
And driven a long way, Panmure to Papamoa, yeah.
Well, the kaimais were impassable at that stage. It took often on a rainy day. It took often a day to pass. So she would have had to have gone to Rotorua and then up. And the Bombays were fared, less better because it was really a dirt track. So this girl who had never driven before, had never been to Auckland before, had no reason to go to Auckland because she knew no one there. And furthermore, she was dressed in a maid's outfit, which she wouldn't have done. Her body arrives.
Yeah, and you mentioned the tyre. Someone had changed the tyre.
And somebody changed the tyre, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else we need to know about the body? I mean, not going into too much detail, but there was no sort of sign of a sexual attack or anything like that?
Not at that stage. I mean, the police went with the theory that perhaps she'd driven off in a fit of jealousy and banged her head, changed the tyre, banged her head, and then wandered off in a daze and then crawled under the bush and died. And so the police weren't really getting anywhere too fast with that. And then when they received sort of the hurry along from the then commissioner, because by this stage the Truth newspaper were getting involved, and I need to add here that the Truth newspaper was most people remember as a scandalous rag, but back in the 1920s, it was one of the few newspapers that covered, a lot of information quite thoroughly, even though it was a little bit far-fetched. But the Truth reporter and Redmer Isker's book about the Truth mentions that they had some of the most colourful writers or colourful journalists, and these people were putting together stories. Basically, the Truth reporter was following the police from door to door, and then they were making up stories as they went. But the stories were, quite dramatic. But it had reached a point where the police weren't getting anywhere with their case, and they brought in a detective called James Bickerdike from Christchurch. Now, Bickerdike was one of those hard-nosed detectives who he was really, at this point in his career, he was really wanting a win because he, in my book, Shot in the Dark, which covers the Elsie Walker case in the chapter beforehand, tells of another unsolved murder of a girl in Christchurch, another housemaid, and Bickerdike, he couldn't secure a conviction for that murder, and so he was really wanting a victory here, and so he was brought in, and he had a look at at the statements of the Baileys, and he actually decided to send Elsie's clothing away for blood analysis. And all of a sudden, one point that the pathologist came back with an addendum to the original statement to say, we believe that Elsie Walker had died as a result of a blow to the head. Now this, I can't begin to say how much this actually surprised the senior police, but it brought in a new track. So they were able to go down the avenue of, okay, so she may have been killed by somebody. Who was it? Elsie's clothing at this stage had come back and it found semen stains on her bloomers and blood, which happened in the period immediately before she disappeared. So forensics science today would be able to confirm who it was, but Bickerdike placed a lot of pressure on the Bailey family, and it was concluded that the semen had arrived on her bloomers as a result of her skylarking with one of the Bailey boys, her cousins. So which one of them it was, no one would admit to. But it changed the whole thing. And so the commission wanted to hurry along. The inquest went ahead. Now the police decided to close in on one of the 5 Bailey boys, and that was Bill. Bill Bailey, he was the oldest one, and he was 21 at that stage. And about a month before Elsie disappeared or was killed or died, Bill left in a hurry and moved to Auckland because Bill was the local ladies' man. He was also a bit of a troublemaker. And he got his 15-year-old neighbour pregnant, and so he basically escaped to Auckland with the help of his mother and set up there. They tried to set him up on a farm. Now, there was a thought that Bill may have, somehow come back to Papamoa because he was, at this stage, his father had kind of disinherited him for when he found out about the scandal. So he was left to his own devices and he didn't have work. And so it was thought that he might have snuck back on the train overnight, and because at that stage the main trunk railway went straight through the Bailey's property in Papamoa, so as it slowed down he could have jumped off and
grabbed
jumped off, got into the house and grabbed the car. But he also there was money missing from the Bailey household, so as well as some of the jewellery. Yet Elsie's purse with her meagre savings in it was still on the table, so Bickerdike came up with a theory that maybe Elsie, while she was cleaning the rubbish, had caught Bill outside, and Bill was robbing the house, looting the house, and perhaps there's a confrontation, and then he hit her. And because the other interesting aspect to that is that where the car was found was pretty close to where Bill had first moved to Auckland a month earlier. So the inquest went for a week, and it was, by this stage, it was really high profile. And Bill went on, took the stand, and he must have thought that he was on trial for his life because, the Vincent Meredith, who was the Crown prosecutor at that stage, was pretty relentless in his cross-examination and had to be held back by the magistrate to say, hey, look, this isn't a murder trial, this is an inquest, we need to find out the cause of death.
Did he have an alibi?
In the end,
yeah. What did he say?
Bill had a number of alibis, and mainly from his wife, his new wife, as well as other people. But later it came out that people couldn't confirm the date that they did see Bill. So it was a little bit airy-fairy, but certainly at that time they were regarded with credence. And the whole sort of theory that Bill might have killed his cousin if there was a sexual motive, people were very conservative back then, and it was probably doubtful.
Yeah. And what sort of forensic technology did they have back then? Because my brain is just boggling, thinking, well, we'd be able to solve that crime ASAP if it was these days because of our technology. But did they have fingerprints and everything like that back in those days?
They did, and the car was fingerprinted. It was extremely dusty, but they could find no fingerprints on it. And when Elsie was stripped at the morgue, her clothes were put in like a closet, and they stayed there for months until they determined that she didn't die of poisoning, and until somebody came out and thought, hey, we better send the bloomers and the clothes off for forensic testing. But Professor Armitage, who was the government bacteriologist at that stage, who tested for blood and semen analysis, he couldn't really give a an accurate guess as to who it was, because the clothes by that stage had dried up. He could confirm that the semen likely would have come from the Baileys, somebody in the Bailey family, but at that stage, still in forensic science, still in its infancy, he couldn't narrow down exactly who.
Oh my gosh. So did they ever have a funeral for her?
Yep, they did. It was attended by Bill and his father. Bill's father came up and he put himself in charge of the funeral. She was buried at Purua Cemetery, and Elsie's dad came up from the coast for the day and then headed back on the train. But the fact that there was death by misadventure just wasn't accepted by the public, and by this stage there's a big furore, and the Minister of Justice lobbied for Parliament to put a commission inquiry to work out how come the police didn't know about or changed the attack about the an accidental death to a possible death by a blow to the head. So the police went on trial, and they said, well, actually, we were floored by the pathologist's change in their opinion, whereas the pathologist said, well, actually, we didn't come to that conclusion first because we thought that she had been poisoned. It was only after that we determined she wasn't poisoned that we thought that the only logical sign of an injury there was that small blow to the head, that she must have died from the blow to the head. So the police were under the knife at that stage, and all the while the Truth newspaper, every week it's there's a new story. Any little tidbit of information was made and elaborated into this massive story. And I encourage listeners to go into papers past where the Truth in 1928 and 29 is accessible, and if you read week by week the articles about Elsie Walker and you compare them to, say, the chapter in my book, which I believe is quite comprehensive, there are two very, very different stories, yet both are quite plausible and quite quite engaging. The Truth paper is highly fictional, and I'll give you an example of a story in that when the police were first searching the area where Elsie was found, they found a minty wrapper. So the minties have been around longer than we have, and it was determined later that one of the Boy Scouts, because there was a Boy Scouts hall sort of quite close by, that one of the Boy Scouts had dropped a minty wrapper. But when the Truth heard about this, then they made a whole article about, well, poor Elsie Walker was sitting on a picnic blanket, possibly eating a minty, while her killer was, walking around and about to strike her, type thing. And you read that and it's like, wow, that's quite amazing. But it was all, this whole story was elaborated over this this innocent minty wrapper.
Oh my gosh, I feel very sad for this case. Like, she sounds like she was just in a terrible situation, but it went unresolved, didn't it? Like, no one was charged.
No one was charged, and after the commission of inquiry, even a neighbour of Constance Bailey wrote to her to say that I saw Bill Bailey on the train that day. Yet when this woman was interviewed earlier, she said that she didn't hear anything. So Constance went to the police and they set up this type of this operation in this hotel room. And back in the day there was no recording devices, so there's a record in my book where Constance Bailey is talking to this woman, and she's clumsily trying to induce a bribe out of this woman, and this woman's sort of standoffish, and in the meantime the detective is in the closet next door with a notebook trying to write in shorthand a recording of this alleged bribery. But
so Bill Bailey's mother was trying to bribe the woman who thought she saw Bill Bailey on the train.
Well, this woman was trying to bribe Bill Bailey's mum, and Bill Bailey's mum was up for it, but she got the police involved, and this woman wouldn't come out and name a price, but you could tell that Constance was saying, well, what can I do? What do you want me to do? And this woman says, well, you tell me what you want me to do. So it went back and forward like that for about an hour. But when that made the news, the fact that Bill was seen on a train, that resulted in another commission of inquiry where the public by this stage were, there were marches to Parliament, there were demonstrations in the Civic Square in Auckland, asking the police to reopen Elsie's case.
Oh, really? So it was quite a big public thing, yeah. It
was massive all around the country. And, Elsie was, a timid 17-year-old girl. So, what she would have made of it, who knows? But she would have been probably quite embarrassed. But the police at that stage couldn't reopen the case. But a law was passed later that if new information came to hand, then the authorities had the were able to reopen a case, but they couldn't with Elsie. So, her case went unsolved for years. But Bill Bailey, I probably need to explain that, even though there was no radio and no TV, people read the newspaper and Bill Bailey's name was mentioned all throughout, and so everybody knew Bill Bailey. And by this stage, he had moved to one of his father's farms to manage one of the father's farms in Ruawaru, which is just slightly northwest of Huntly, quite a remote area. And Bill had fallen out with his neighbours, Sam and Christabel Lakey, to the point there was a massive feud, and Bill went over one day and had a go at them about something, and Mrs. Lakey accused him of killing Elsie Walker, and we expect the same. And, one day in 1933, farmers in the area noticed that the Lakey's milk hadn't been taken down for collection, and they went to go search the farm for them and found Pet Lakey, or Christabel Lakey's body. She had been beaten to death, and her body was laid out in a pond, and they couldn't find Sam Lakey, and they searched for days and days, but some quite astute detectives who'd come down from Auckland searched the garden and the fence line and found burnt bits of was later determined to be Sam Lakey. So in short, what happened was that Sam Lakey may have been shot dead, and then his body put in a oil drum and burnt beyond, and so his remains were scattered beyond the farm. And so Bill Bailey was the likeliest suspect, and so he went to trial, and he was indeed found guilty of the double murder and hanged.
Oh, no way. And they didn't open the other case at all, the Elsie Walker case?
No, so effectively that Elsie Walker's case is still unresolved.
Oh my gosh. That is a turn, the Lakey deaths. So what, do you know anything about what the Bailey family did after he murdered his neighbours? Did they disown him, or was there any, did they turn up to court or support his son?
Well, they did, and Constance Bailey was, at his side all throughout, and she would probably admit up to her dying day that Bill was innocent of everything. Certainly, the Baileys were quite a well-respected family in the wider Papamoa Te Puke community, and the whole scandal, certainly back in the day, they pretty much withdrew into themselves. I know that when I researched the book, I did get in contact with members of Elsie's descendants, or not so much her immediate descendants, but she had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. So I contacted some descendants who were quite elderly then, who don't recall Elsie but know all about the case, and they don't have much love for the Bailey family, even perhaps to this day.
Right.
They certainly believe that he was guilty. Whereas, there was it's probably unfair to blame Bill for Elsie's death, because it was never proved. And as I say, he did have alibis. Some of them, and I certainly believe that the sighting on the train by Mrs. Thompson, the lady next door, was false, and it was only in the end she sold her story to The Truth and got quite a bit of money out of it.
Which may have been a lie anyway.
I'd say so, because Bill would have come, if Bill had killed Elsie, he would have come on the overnight train in the dead of night, which was a goods train. He would have easily been able to stow aboard, whereas Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Langdon, the 2 sisters, they claim to have seen Bill, at some point during a day, a couple of days before. Mrs. Langdon, when she was interviewed, first denied it, but then after meeting up with her sister, then told Truth that, no, he definitely was on the train because I saw him first.
Oh my gosh, it's so uncomfortable thinking how sad this is, and that he was never charged, or that, no one was ever charged for her death. There's a lot of cases that sometimes get reopened years and years on. Is this case, could it ever be reopened, do you think?
Oh, look, I don't think so.
No.
Certainly, reading the police file, they did everything in their power to get to the bottom of it. And I'm not saying that Detective Bickerdike, resorted to, anything untoward. He was just looking for a different angle because the original theory was just so far-fetched, yet it wasn't logical. So they had to go down a different tact, and placing pressure on the Bailey family certainly opened up more avenues of inquiry. If Elsie's killer was alive today, which I seriously doubt, then I still think that the case wouldn't be reopened. So much time has passed. Elsie's bloomers and her clothing, I've got photos of that in my book, but they are still held at archives. In fact, the police museum may have them now, but you wouldn't be able to get anything from them. But certainly if that scenario happened today, if Elsie disappeared today and we go through the same scenario, there's no doubt in my mind that that case wouldn't be solved immediately.
Do you think you know who killed... could you say, I think Bill Bailey did it?
I do think that Bill Bailey was responsible, but then I've also... I've been mulling this over for years and years.
I bet.
But I do wonder whether or not, Frank Bailey, who's, the patriarch of the household, he may have had something to do with it too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Crimes NZ, hosted by me, Jesse Mulligan. And a big thanks to Scott Bainbridge. You can read more about this case and many others in his book, Shot in the Dark. This podcast is produced by Melita Tull, Charlie Drever, Sam Hollis and Ayana Piper-Helian. It's been edited by Grant Walker and Liz Garton. Tim Watkin is executive producer of RNZ Podcasts. You can find Crimes NZ and all RNZ's great podcasts, like the Aotearoa History Show, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. It's now also on YouTube.